Imagine spending 10 years hunting one man. 10 years of dead ends, false leads, buried intelligence, and buried soldiers. Osama bin Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden was born in the city of Riyadh, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, in the year 1957. He was the 17th of what would eventually be over 50 children fathered by his father, Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, a billionaire construction magnate who had built an empire on government contracts and had close ties to the Saudi royal family. By most accounts, Osama bin Laden grew up in considerable comfort, educated at elite schools, surrounded by wealth and privilege. There was nothing in his early childhood that might have suggested the path he would eventually choose. He was quiet, studious, reportedly deeply religious from a young age. He was not, by any outward measure, a revolutionary, but the world of his adolescence was a world in ferment. Across the Middle East, the tension between Western influence and Islamic tradition was building to a boil. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 shook the foundations of the geopolitical order. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that same year lit a fuse that would burn for decades. And bin Laden, by then a young man in his early 20s, found himself drawn toward that fire. He traveled to Afghanistan. He used his family's money and his family's connections to support the Mujahideen fighters battling Soviet occupation. He was celebrated in many circles, including in Washington, where the CIA was funneling money and weapons to the same fighters in a Cold War proxy battle against the Soviets. At one point in history, Osama bin Laden and the government of the United States were, however indirectly, on the same side. That, of course, did not last. The Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989. They had been defeated. The Mujahideen had prevailed. And Osama bin Laden came away from that conflict with a conviction that would define the rest of his life. That a small, determined force of faithful fighters could bring down a superpower. The lesson he drew from Afghanistan was not just tactical. It was theological. God, he believed, had delivered the victory. And that same God, he believed, had given him a mission. In 1988, even before the Soviet withdrawal was complete, bin Laden and a small group of associates had formed a new organization. They called it al-Qaeda, which translates from Arabic as the base or the foundation. Its purpose, as bin Laden envisioned it, was to serve as a vanguard of a global Islamic revolutionary movement. Not simply a military force. Not simply a terrorist network, though terror would become its primary instrument. But an ideological project, a movement that sought to overthrow what bin Laden called the corrupt and apostate regimes of the Muslim world, expel Western influence from Muslim lands, and ultimately establish a unified Islamic caliphate governed by his interpretation of Sharia law. In the years that followed, al-Qaeda evolved, recruited, plotted, and struck. The bombing of the American embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, in 1998 killed 224 people and wounded thousands more. The attack on the USS Cole in the Yemeni port of Aden in 2000 killed 17 American sailors and nearly sank the ship. And then came the 11th of September 2001, the attack that changed everything. The attack that turned a man who had been a relatively obscure figure in the American public consciousness into the most wanted person on the planet. And then he vanished. In the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks, American intelligence believed bin Laden was in Afghanistan, operating under the protection of the Taliban government. When American and coalition forces invaded Afghanistan in October of 2001 and the Taliban regime collapsed with stunning speed, bin Laden was reportedly cornered in the mountain fortress of Tora Bora, in the White Mountains near the Pakistani border. There, according to later investigations, a decision was made not to commit American ground forces in sufficient numbers to seal off his escape routes. And bin Laden, by most accounts, slipped through. He crossed into Pakistan. And then he disappeared. For years, the trail went cold. The intelligence community poured resources into the search. The United States government offered a reward of $25 million for information leading to his capture. Tips poured in from around the world, and nearly every one of them led nowhere. There were moments when analysts believed they were close, when signals intelligence suggested he might be in this valley or that village, when human sources claimed knowledge of his whereabouts. And every time, the intelligence either proved false, or the window closed before action could be taken, or the trail simply went dead again. Years passed, 1 year became 2 years, became 3 years, became 5 years, became 7 years. The world began to wonder whether bin Laden would ever be found. Some began to whisper the unthinkable, that he might never be found. What kept the CIA from giving up, what ultimately cracked the case after nearly a decade of failure, was a single thread. A single piece of intelligence that had been tugged at for years before it finally yielded something of value. The story of how the CIA found bin Laden is, in itself, a masterclass in the slow, grinding, often maddening business of intelligence work. It is a story about a courier. In the world of al-Qaeda's internal communications, electronic channels were understood to be compromised. The organization had learned, through hard experience, that phones could be tapped, emails could be intercepted, internet activity could be monitored. Bin Laden himself was famously careful about electronic communications. He did not use the internet. He did not use cell phones. He communicated with the outside world through a network of trusted couriers, men who would carry messages physically, by hand, moving between safe houses and border crossings with information that never touched a digital wire. Among these couriers, one was known to the CIA by his nom de guerre, an alias. For years, analysts had seen references to this individual in intercepted communications, in documents captured from al-Qaeda members who had been detained. They believed he was one of bin Laden's most trusted personal couriers, a man with direct access to the al-Qaeda leader. They needed to find him. Finding him, they believed, might lead them to bin Laden himself. The details of how the CIA ultimately identified the courier, tracked him, and eventually followed him to a compound in Abbottabad are classified in their finer points, and will likely remain so for many years. What is known is that in 2010, after years of painstaking work, analysts identified the courier and began surveillance. They followed him, they watched, and eventually, he led them to a walled compound on the outskirts of Abbottabad, a garrison town in northern Pakistan, roughly 35 miles from the Pakistani capital of Islamabad, and approximately 800 meters from the main campus of the Pakistan Military Academy, the Pakistani equivalent of West Point. What the CIA found at that compound made no sense for a simple courier. The structure was enormous by the standards of the neighborhood. It sat on an approximately 3/8 of an acre plot of land. It was surrounded by walls that reached as high as 18 feet in some places, topped with barbed wire. The compound had no telephone lines, no internet connection. Residents burned their own trash rather than putting it out for collection, a telling detail that spoke to an almost paranoid concern for privacy. The value of the land and the construction was estimated to be far beyond what the known occupants could plausibly afford. Something was being hidden in that compound. Something or someone of enormous value. For months, the CIA watched. They established a safe house nearby. They used satellite imagery, drone surveillance, and every technical tool at their disposal to try to understand what was happening inside those walls. They observed a tall, thin man who occasionally emerged to walk in circles in the compound's small outdoor courtyard, always staying close to the main building, never leaving the compound entirely. They called him the Pacer. They could not confirm his identity with certainty, but everything they saw was consistent with one conclusion. By the summer of 2010, senior CIA analysts began to assess with increasing confidence that the tall man walking in circles inside that high-walled compound was Osama bin Laden. By the fall of that year, they brought their assessment to President Barack Obama, and the planning for what would become Operation Neptune Spear began. The planning took months. Multiple options were considered and debated at the highest levels of the U.S. government. One option was a conventional airstrike, using precision-guided munitions to destroy the compound entirely. This option was clean in some respects, carried the least risk to American personnel, but it had a critical flaw. It would almost certainly produce no body, no physical confirmation that bin Laden was actually dead. And given the intelligence community's incomplete confidence that the tall man in the compound was indeed bin Laden, a strike that killed an innocent family and destroyed a building would have been a catastrophe. Another option was a strike using a B-2 stealth bomber, delivering a payload that would essentially obliterate the compound down to its foundations. This option was also rejected, again partly because of the uncertainty about bin Laden's presence, and partly because of the enormous size of the bombs required. which would likely have caused significant civilian casualties in the surrounding neighborhood. The option that was ultimately chosen was the most complicated and the most dangerous, but also the most precise. A helicopter assault, carried out by the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, commonly known as SEAL Team 6, America's most elite counterterrorism unit. 2 teams of SEALs would be inserted by helicopter in the dead of night, breach the compound, neutralize any armed resistance, confirm the identity of the target, eliminate the target, and extract. The entire operation was intended to take no longer than 40 minutes. In and out before Pakistani military forces, whose complicity in sheltering bin Laden was widely suspected within American intelligence circles, could respond. The mission was codenamed Operation Neptune Spear. The date selected was the 1st of May 2011, a Sunday night in Pakistan, a Sunday afternoon in Washington. 40 years, almost to the day, after the Vietnamese city of Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces, marking the end of another long and agonizing American conflict in a distant land. The weather didn't cooperate. Dust clouds over the region forced a 24-hour delay. The mission launched on the night of the 2nd of May, 2011 Pakistani time, the 1st of May on the American East Coast. 2 stealth Black Hawk helicopters carrying approximately 24 Navy SEALs, along with a translator and a military working dog, crossed from Afghanistan into Pakistani airspace without alerting Pakistani radar, a feat of technological sophistication that underscored just how seriously American planners had taken the possibility that Pakistani authorities might tip off the target if they knew the raid was coming. What happened inside that compound in the minutes that followed has been described in varying accounts by participants, officials, and journalists in the years since. Some details remain disputed. Some remain classified, but the broad outline is well established. The first helicopter, as it hovered over the compound, experienced a phenomenon known as vortex ring state, a dangerous loss of lift caused by the interaction between the rotor wash and the high walls of the compound. The aircraft descended rapidly and its tail clipped the compound wall. The pilot executed a controlled crash, keeping the helicopter from rolling over but leaving it stuck in the courtyard, its tail rotor destroyed. The second helicopter, seeing what had happened, landed outside the compound walls. None of this stopped the mission. The SEALs adapted instantly, as they are trained to do, and breached the compound on foot. They moved through the building systematically, floor by floor, room by room, dealing with armed resistance as they encountered it. Bin Laden's couriers were killed. A woman who rushed toward the SEALs was wounded in the leg. And on the 3rd floor of the main building, in a sparse bedroom, the SEALs found the man they had come for. The confirmation happened quickly. Osama bin Laden was killed. The world's most wanted terrorist, the man who had orchestrated the murder of nearly 3,000 people and set off a decade of war and global anxiety, was dead. The mission clock showed approximately 38 minutes had elapsed since the first helicopter crossed into Pakistani airspace. But the mission was not over. Not the part that would matter most to the intelligence analysts waiting back in Virginia. Because the SEALs had also been briefed, with the utmost seriousness, on their second objective. Before they left that compound, before they destroyed the downed helicopter and exfiltrated with bin Laden's body, they were to collect everything they could find. Every hard drive, every flash drive, every compact disc, every document, every piece of paper, every handwritten note, every letter, every photograph, every electronic device of any kind. They were to strip that compound of its secrets as thoroughly and as rapidly as humanly possible. What they found exceeded anyone's expectations. The SEALs moved through the compound with collection bags, sweeping up materials at a pace dictated by the ticking clock and the very real possibility of Pakistani military response. Hard drives were pulled from computers. Flash drives were gathered by the handful. Stacks of documents, letters, and notebooks were seized. Electronic devices of various kinds were collected. The total haul, by the time the SEALs exfiltrated with bin Laden's body and the collected materials, was described by American officials in subsequent days and weeks as extraordinary, staggering, unprecedented in the history of counterterrorism intelligence collection. The exact scope of what was collected took time to emerge. In the days immediately after the raid, American officials were cautious in their public statements about the intelligence haul, partly for operational security reasons and partly because the work of cataloging and beginning to analyze the materials had barely begun. But within weeks, the general contours began to take shape in public reporting. The collection included thousands of pages of written correspondence and documents, and hundreds of thousands of digital files. Hundreds of thousands. The number, when it was first reported, was almost difficult to process. A private individual, hiding in a residential compound, had accumulated a digital archive of hundreds of thousands of files. Letters written over years, strategic assessments, operational plans, personal communications, financial records, videos, audio recordings, the accumulated output of a man who, despite living in hiding and communicating almost entirely through physical couriers, had maintained a level of personal documentation that would have been impressive even for a head of state. The intelligence community had a name for a collection like this. They called it a treasure trove, and this one, by virtually every account, was the largest and richest treasure trove they had ever encountered. The work of processing, translating, analyzing, and ultimately selectively declassifying the materials from the Abbottabad compound would take years. The Defense Intelligence Agency, the CIA, the National Security Agency, the FBI, and a constellation of other agencies and organizations all had roles to play in that process. Translators worked through Arabic documents. Technical analysts worked through the digital files. Counterterrorism experts pored over strategic communications looking for names, for networks, for operational details that might help them identify threats before they materialized. And gradually, over years, through a combination of official declassifications, academic analysis, and investigative journalism, a picture emerged. Not a complete picture. Much of what was found in that compound remains classified and will remain so for the foreseeable future. But enough has come out to tell a story that is, in some respects, quite different from the story the world thought it knew. The story the world thought it knew about Osama bin Laden in the years immediately after September 11 was the story of a man who had retreated entirely from operational command of al-Qaeda. A man who was living in such extreme isolation, so cut off from the outside world by the necessity of hiding from the most powerful intelligence services on Earth, that he had become essentially a figurehead. A symbolic leader whose image and rhetoric still inspired violence but who no longer directed it. This was a comforting story in some ways because it suggested that even if bin Laden could not be found, he had been effectively neutralized, contained, rendered irrelevant by the very success of the global counterterrorism campaign that had squeezed his network, killed or captured his lieutenants, and forced him into ever deeper hiding. The documents from Abbottabad told a different story. Bin Laden, the documents revealed, was not a symbolic figurehead. He was not a disconnected relic. He was operational. He was engaged. He was thinking, planning, advising, directing, and worrying in extraordinary detail about the strategic direction of his organization and the global movement he had devoted his life to building. The correspondence seized from the compound showed a man who was deeply involved in the internal debates and decisions of al-Qaeda, who had strong and detailed opinions about strategy and tactics, who was frustrated by the actions of some affiliate organizations, and who was, above all, keenly aware of the ways in which al-Qaeda's reputation and standing in the Muslim world had been damaged by years of operations that had killed large numbers of Muslim civilians. This last point was perhaps the most striking revelation to emerge from the Abbottabad documents, and it is worth dwelling on at some length, because it shattered one of the most persistent myths about bin Laden and al-Qaeda, the myth that they were indifferent to, or even celebratory of, civilian casualties in the Muslim world. The reality, as the documents showed, was far more complicated, and in some ways more disturbing. Bin Laden was, in the years of his hiding, a man consumed by concern about al-Qaeda's brand. That word, brand, might seem jarring in this context, but it is not inappropriate. Bin Laden thought carefully and systematically about how al-Qaeda was perceived, not in the West, whose opinion he held in contempt, but in the Muslim world whose hearts and minds he understood were essential to his project. And what he saw in the years after September 11 troubled him deeply. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the franchise organization that had emerged in the chaos following the American invasion of 2003, had become a byword for indiscriminate brutality. Its leader, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, had embraced a strategy of deliberate sectarian violence, targeting not just American forces and their allies but Iraqi Shia Muslims in a deliberate campaign to ignite a civil war. The bombings of mosques, the beheadings broadcast on the internet, the mass casualty attacks on civilian markets, all of it had generated enormous revulsion not just in the West but throughout the Muslim world. Bin Laden, the documents showed, had been alarmed by this. He had tried, through intermediaries, to restrain Zarqawi. He had argued, in internal correspondence, that al-Qaeda's strategy needed to be more discriminating, more politically sophisticated, more attuned to the sensibilities of the Muslim populations whose support was necessary for the long-term success of the movement. He had largely failed, and the documents showed his frustration. There is something deeply strange about reading correspondence in which a man responsible for the murder of thousands of people worries about the reputational damage done by the murder of thousands of other people. It requires a kind of moral accounting that is at once revealing and deeply unsettling. Bin Laden's concern was not humanitarian. He was not, in these letters, expressing regret for the suffering of innocent people. His concern was strategic. He understood that al-Qaeda's long-term project required popular support in the Muslim world, and that indiscriminate violence was eroding that support. He was, in a sense, applying a cold-blooded cost-benefit analysis to atrocity. But the documents also showed something else. They showed a man who was, in private, grappling with the gap between his grand ambitions and the much messier reality of what his organization had actually achieved. The al-Qaeda of Bin Laden's imagination was a disciplined vanguard, a sophisticated revolutionary organization that would inspire and direct a global uprising. The al-Qaeda that had actually evolved was a looser, more chaotic thing. A franchise network of affiliated organizations that shared a name and a broad ideology but operated with considerable independence and often in ways that Bin Laden found counterproductive, embarrassing, or strategically dangerous. The documents from Abbottabad painted a picture of a leader who was deeply frustrated by this gap, who spent considerable energy in private correspondence trying to shape and redirect the behavior of affiliate organizations, and who recognized, with what seems to have been painful clarity, that the movement he had built was in many ways beyond his control. This is a crucially important insight, because one of the central questions in the study of terrorism is whether decentralized, networked organizations like al-Qaeda are strengthened or weakened by the loss of centralized control. The optimistic view, which informed much American counterterrorism strategy, held that degrading the core leadership of al-Qaeda would effectively neutralize the organization, that without Bin Laden's direction and al-Qaeda's central command, the affiliates would fragment, lose coherence, and gradually wither away. The documents from Abbottabad suggested something more complicated, that the affiliates had already achieved a disturbing degree of independence, that they were pursuing their own agendas in ways that sometimes conflicted with Bin Laden's wishes, and that the death of Bin Laden, rather than ending the threat, might simply accelerate a process of fragmentation that was already well underway. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now with the words "I am still here." Let us see who is truly following this story all the way through. And while you are down there, hit that like button. It tells us you want more investigations like this one. Now let us keep going, because this story is about to get even deeper. Among the hundreds of thousands of digital files recovered from the Abbottabad compound, analysts found a collection of videos that offered a window into the private world of the man the cameras had never quite captured. There were videos of Bin Laden watching himself on television, an image that became famous when the US government selectively released it in the weeks after the raid. A gray-bearded old man, wrapped in a blanket, hunched over a small television, watching footage of himself. The image was deliberately chosen by American officials to undercut the mythology that had built up around Bin Laden over a decade, to present him not as a fearsome warrior prophet but as an aging, vain, almost pathetic figure, obsessed with his own image. But the videos told other stories too. They showed a man who was, for all his isolation, intellectually active, politically engaged, and still capable of the kind of strategic thinking that had made him so dangerous. They showed a man who had not given up, who still believed, in the compound where he had been hiding for years, that history was moving in his direction, who still thought he could win. The written correspondence recovered from the compound gave the fullest picture of Bin Laden's inner life in the years of his hiding. Letters written to and from lieutenants around the world, many of them written in a flowery, classical Arabic style that reflected Bin Laden's religious education and his sense of his own place in Islamic history. Letters discussing strategy, discussing tactics, discussing the behavior of affiliates, discussing the state of the global jihad, discussing the Arab Spring uprisings that had swept the Middle East and North Africa beginning in late 2010 and that bin Laden, with great irony, had found deeply ambivalent about. The Arab Spring was, on its face, exactly what bin Laden had spent his life working toward: a popular uprising against the corrupt authoritarian regimes of the Arab world. But it was happening in a way that, from bin Laden's perspective, was profoundly wrong. The young people filling the streets of Cairo and Tunis and Tripoli and Sana'a and Manama were not calling for an Islamic caliphate. They were not carrying al-Qaeda's black banner. They were calling for democracy, for human rights, for economic opportunity, for the end of corruption. They were, in short, pursuing a vision of political change that was entirely incompatible with bin Laden's own vision. And they were succeeding, at least in some cases, in ways that al-Qaeda's decade of violence had completely failed to achieve. The documents show bin Laden wrestling with this problem. How could he position al-Qaeda as relevant to a wave of popular change that had nothing to do with his organization and that was, in many cases, pursuing goals he explicitly rejected? His answer, characteristically, was to try to co-opt the narrative, to argue that the Arab Spring uprisings were the beginning of a longer process that would, ultimately, lead to the kind of Islamic revolution he had always envisioned. The secular Democrats winning the streets today, he argued to his correspondents, would be replaced in time by more religiously oriented forces. History, he insisted, was on his side. He was wrong about some of this, as history has shown, but not entirely wrong. The years following the Arab Spring would see the rise of the Islamic State, a movement that was, in some ways, the fulfillment of bin Laden's worst strategic fears and, in other ways, the violent manifestation of exactly the kind of apocalyptic nihilism he had always claimed to oppose. The fall of bin Laden and the subsequent fragmentation of al-Qaeda did not, as American officials had hoped, lead to the end of jihadist terrorism. It led, instead, to the emergence of something even more extreme and, in the short term, even more destructive. The compound in Abbottabad had been bin Laden's home for what American officials estimated was at least 5 years, possibly longer. 5 years in a building he almost never left. 5 years of walking in circles in a small courtyard, of watching himself on a flickering television, of writing letters that would travel to their destinations by the hands of trusted couriers, slowly, carefully, with the elaborate precautions of a man who understood that every communication was a potential thread that could be pulled until it led back to him. How did he live? The documents and the physical evidence from the compound gave some answers. He had at least 2 and possibly 3 wives living with him in the compound, along with a number of his children and grandchildren. The compound housed, at any given time, somewhere between 15 and 25 people. It was, in a strange way, a family home, however perverted the family dynamics must have been. The same building that was the nerve center of the world's most dangerous terrorist organization was also a place where children played, where meals were cooked, where the ordinary rhythms of domestic life went on alongside the extraordinary and secret life of the man who lived in the room upstairs. Bin Laden's personal situation in the compound was, by many accounts, deeply uncomfortable, at least psychologically. The isolation was almost total. He could not call his family in Saudi Arabia. He could not reach out to old friends or associates. He was, for all practical purposes, cut off from the world, dependent on couriers for every contact with the outside, unable to leave the compound for fear of exposure. He was, in the compound, both a prisoner and a king, a man of enormous symbolic power who was, in practical terms, almost entirely powerless. The financial picture that emerged from the documents was also revealing. Al-Qaeda's finances had been severely disrupted by the decade of counterterrorism pressure that followed September 11. The organization that had once had access to bin Laden's personal fortune and a network of sympathetic donors across the Gulf states had been squeezed, hunted, and cut off from many of its traditional funding sources. The documents showed an organization that was, at times, struggling financially, that was unable to pay its operatives, that was worried about its ability to sustain its operations in the face of relentless pressure from American drone strikes, which had devastated al-Qaeda's leadership in the tribal areas of Pakistan where the core organization had taken refuge. But the documents also showed that al-Qaeda was not finished. Far from it. Even in its diminished state, it retained the capacity to plan and to inspire. The affiliate organizations in Yemen, in North Africa, in Somalia, in Southeast Asia, were active and growing. The ideology that bin Laden had spent his life propagating had spread far beyond the reach of any one organization, embedded itself in the grievances and aspirations of young men across the Muslim world, and taken on a life of its own that no amount of drone strikes or special operations raids could fully extinguish. One of the most significant categories of material recovered from the Abbottabad compound was the collection of correspondence related to the ongoing debate within al-Qaeda about strategy and tactics in the face of American drone strikes. By 2010, the CIA's drone program in Pakistan's tribal areas had become one of the most controversial and consequential counterterrorism tools in the American arsenal. Strikes were killing al-Qaeda leaders and operatives at a rate that was, by any measure, unprecedented. But they were also killing civilians, generating enormous resentment among Pakistani and Afghan populations, and creating a narrative of American aggression that al-Qaeda's propagandists were exploiting with considerable effectiveness. Bin Laden's correspondence showed him deeply aware of the drone strikes, concerned about the losses his organization was suffering, and thinking carefully about how al-Qaeda could adapt and survive in the face of this new threat. He discussed the importance of decentralization, of dispersing the organization's leadership and capabilities to reduce the vulnerability created by the concentration of key personnel in a small geographic area. He discussed the importance of operational security, of maintaining strict communications discipline, of identifying and eliminating potential infiltrators. He was, in short, doing what he had always done, thinking strategically about how to keep his organization alive and effective against an adversary with overwhelming conventional military power. There was also, in the recovered documents, material that gave new insight into al-Qaeda's thinking about operations against the United States itself. The September 11 attacks had been, in al-Qaeda's own assessment, a spectacular tactical success but a strategic gamble whose long-term consequences were, at best, mixed. The American response had been far more forceful and far more sustained than al-Qaeda had anticipated. The organization had been driven from its Afghan sanctuary, its leadership had been decimated, its financing had been disrupted. By 2011, bin Laden was living in a walled compound 35 miles from the Pakistani capital, cut off from his organization, unable to leave his bedroom without fear. Whatever else September 11 had been, it had not been the beginning of the great American collapse that bin Laden had expected to set in motion. Yet he had never given up on the idea of another spectacular attack against the American homeland. The documents showed him thinking and corresponding about possible future operations, discussing targets, discussing methods, discussing the challenge of penetrating American security, which had been dramatically enhanced in the years after September 11. He was particularly interested in attacks on transportation infrastructure, especially railroads. Whether any of these discussions ever progressed beyond the level of general planning to the point of operational readiness is unclear from the available documents. What is clear is that even in his isolation, even in his reduced circumstances, bin Laden had not abandoned the ambition that had driven him for his entire adult life. The physical evidence recovered from the compound added another dimension to the picture. Alongside the documents and digital files, the SEALs had collected various personal effects that together painted a portrait of a man living in circumstances quite different from the warrior monk image that his propaganda had carefully cultivated. There were medical supplies suggesting ongoing health concerns. There were toiletries and personal items. There was a collection of pornographic videos, a detail that American officials chose to disclose and that generated considerable attention and commentary, partly because it seemed to contradict the image of austere religious piety that bin Laden had projected throughout his career, and partly because, in the context of the broader revelations about his private life, it seemed to add a note of almost mundane human weakness to the portrait of a mass murderer. The compound also contained evidence of the very human drama of a family living in extreme circumstances. Children's books, school supplies, medical records, the detritus of ordinary life, rendered extraordinary by the identity of the compound's primary resident. The people living in that building had been, in many ways, prisoners too. The wives and children of Osama bin Laden had spent years in a heavily guarded compound, unable to leave, unable to communicate freely with the outside world, their fates tied to the fate of the man whose decisions had brought them all to this place. The question of what happened to those family members in the aftermath of the raid became one of the many contentious issues that marked the months and years following the death of bin Laden. They were taken into custody by Pakistani authorities and held for an extended period. The fate of some of them, particularly bin Laden's younger wives and his children and grandchildren, remained uncertain for some time. The broader question of Pakistan's role in the entire affair was one that the documents from Abbottabad had, paradoxically, done relatively little to resolve. The presence of Osama bin Laden in a large, fortified compound just down the road from Pakistan's most prestigious military academy, in a city with a large garrison of Pakistani military and intelligence personnel, was an almost impossible coincidence to accept at face value. Either Pakistani authorities had known, at some level, that bin Laden was in Abbottabad and had chosen to shelter him, or the Pakistani Intelligence Service, the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate or ISI, had suffered a catastrophic failure of intelligence collection in its own backyard. Neither explanation was comfortable for the United States government, which had poured billions of dollars in aid and military assistance into Pakistan as a counterterrorism partner. The Pakistani government's official position was that they had known nothing, that bin Laden had escaped their notice in Abbottabad, that the failure was genuine and not deliberate. American officials, at least in public, chose to accept this explanation, or at least to avoid directly challenging it, because the relationship with Pakistan, however dysfunctional, remained strategically important in ways that made a direct confrontation costly. The documents from Abbottabad, for all their revelations about bin Laden's inner life and al-Qaeda's internal workings, did not contain the smoking gun that might have definitively answered the question of whether Pakistan had harbored the world's most wanted terrorist. That question, in the end, may never be fully answered. It will likely remain one of the most significant and troubling unanswered questions of the entire post-September 11 era, a reminder that even the most extraordinary intelligence haul leaves gaps, leaves shadows, leaves room for doubt. The process of declassifying and releasing material from the Abbottabad compound was itself a story about the tension between the intelligence community's natural tendency towards secrecy and the public's legitimate interest in understanding what the government had found. The first batch of documents was released by the Director of National Intelligence in May of 2012, approximately 1 year after the raid. The release was greeted with enormous interest by scholars, journalists, and terrorism analysts around the world, who descended on the newly available material with the kind of intensity usually reserved for newly discovered historical archives. What they found was fascinating and sometimes surprising. The documents confirmed the picture that had begun to emerge through earlier reporting. A bin Laden who was actively engaged in al-Qaeda's affairs, frustrated by the behavior of affiliates, worried about the organization's direction and reputation, and still committed to the long-term project of global jihadist revolution. But they also added texture and detail that complicated and enriched the picture. Bin Laden emerged from these documents as a surprisingly nuanced strategic thinker, a man who could be simultaneously visionary and petty, inspiring and frustrated, globally ambitious and locally paranoid. He was someone who wrote at length about the importance of avoiding civilian casualties in one letter and then, in another context, contemplated attacks that would have produced them by the thousands. Subsequent releases of Abbottabad documents added further layers. In 2016, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a much larger tranche of materials, including a remarkable collection of books and texts from bin Laden's digital library, which gave an extraordinary window into what he had been reading in the years of his hiding. The collection was eclectic, to say the least. Alongside the expected religious texts and jihadist literature, it included books on American foreign policy, on the history of intelligence operations, on conspiracy theories of various kinds, on international relations and geopolitics. Bin Laden, it turned out, had been an avid reader of a wide range of material, including material produced by his enemies about the war on terror. He read American accounts of the September 11 attacks and their aftermath. He read analyses of al-Qaeda's strategic failures. He read, in other words, his own press. One of the more poignant aspects of the Abbottabad documents, though poignant may be a strange word to apply to material produced by a mass murderer, is the picture they paint of a man who understood, in his heart, that the world was not going the way he had hoped. The grand project of his life, the violent reordering of the global order along the lines of his interpretation of Islamic tradition, had not succeeded. The attacks he had orchestrated had brought down enormous suffering on the innocent people who had died and on the Muslim populations of Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and elsewhere who had borne the brunt of the American military response. The movement he had created had fragmented into competing factions, many of which were, in his view, counterproductive or even actively harmful to the cause he had devoted his life to. He was old. He was ill. He was hiding in a compound. And the world outside was going on without him. The Arab Spring had shown that the Muslim world was capable of dramatic collective action without al-Qaeda and, more troublingly for bin Laden, without any interest in his vision. The young people of Egypt and Tunisia and Libya and Syria were not inspired by his theology. They were inspired by Facebook and Twitter and a hunger for dignity and economic opportunity that al-Qaeda had nothing to offer them. The ideology that bin Laden had constructed at such enormous cost, in lives and treasure and moral standing, was simply not what these people were looking for. And yet he could not stop, could not admit that he had been wrong, could not step back from a project that had consumed 40 years of his life and caused untold suffering. The documents show a man who kept going, kept writing, kept advising, kept planning, because to stop would have been to admit that all of it, the bombings and the murders and the wars and the suffering, had been for nothing. The death of bin Laden on the 2nd of May, 2011, was celebrated around the world. In American cities, crowds gathered spontaneously outside the White House, in Times Square, at Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan, to mark the end of the manhunt. President Obama, in a late-night address to the nation, announced that justice had been done. The announcement set off a complex wave of emotions: relief, pride, grief, unease. For the families of the nearly 3,000 people who had died on September 11, it was a moment that had been 10 years in coming, a moment of complicated feelings that defied easy description. Many spoke of a kind of closure, however incomplete. Some spoke of the impossibility of closure, of the fact that the death of the man who had ordered the attacks did not and could not bring back anyone who had been taken from them. For the intelligence community, the death of bin Laden was significant, but the Abbottabad documents were, in some respects, even more significant. They provided, for the first time, a genuine window into the inner workings of al-Qaeda at the highest level. They allowed analysts to map networks, identify operatives, understand decision-making processes, and assess the true state of an organization they had spent a decade trying to understand from the outside. The value of that intelligence was, by any measure, enormous. But the story did not end with the raid. The story continued in the years that followed, as analysts and scholars worked through the materials, as portions of the archive were declassified and made public, and as the broader consequences of the killing of bin Laden played out in ways that were sometimes expected and sometimes deeply surprising. The rise of the Islamic State, beginning in earnest in 2013 and reaching its peak in 2014 and 2015, was, in a perverse sense, the most significant consequence of the death of bin Laden. The Islamic State, also known as ISIS or ISIL or by its Arabic acronym Daesh, was, in organizational terms, a product of al-Qaeda in Iraq, the same franchise organization whose indiscriminate brutality had so troubled bin Laden in his Abbottabad correspondence. It had grown in the power vacuum created by the withdrawal of American forces from Iraq and the descent of Syria into civil war. And it had moved with startling speed to declare a caliphate, a physical territory governed by its interpretation of Islamic law, the very thing that bin Laden had always dreamed of but never achieved. The Islamic State was, in almost every way that mattered, the fulfillment of bin Laden's worst nightmare. It was more extreme than al-Qaeda, more brutal, more indiscriminate, more willing to kill Muslims in large numbers. Its rise had been precisely what bin Laden had warned against in his Abbottabad correspondence. A nihilistic force that would destroy al-Qaeda's carefully cultivated image of disciplined revolutionary Islam and replace it with something that the vast majority of Muslims, even those sympathetic to al-Qaeda's broader critique of Western influence, found repellent. But the Islamic State was also, in a darker sense, a product of the same forces that bin Laden had spent his life cultivating. It drew on the same ideological traditions. It recruited from the same pool of grievances. It inspired the same kind of violence. And it proved, conclusively, that the death of a single leader, however symbolically important, does not end an ideology, does not stop the violence, does not resolve the deep structural conditions of poverty, exclusion, humiliation, and political dysfunction that provide the fertile soil in which extremism grows. The intelligence haul from Abbottabad, valuable as it was, did not solve the problem of terrorism. It provided a snapshot of al-Qaeda at a particular moment, a snapshot of remarkable richness and detail, but still just a snapshot. The world had moved on. New organizations had emerged. New ideologies had mutated from the original. New generations of young men had been radicalized by new tools and new platforms that Osama bin Laden, in his compound without internet access, had never even used. The documents from Abbottabad will, in time, become historical materials in the fullest sense, primary sources for scholars and historians trying to understand one of the defining conflicts of the early 21st century. They are already, in the portions that have been declassified and released, among the most important primary sources available for the study of al-Qaeda, of jihadist ideology, and of the inner workings of the global war on terror. They give us access to the private mind of a man who shaped the world in which we live, who set in motion forces that are still playing out, who killed thousands of people in service of a vision that ultimately failed, though not without leaving permanent scars on the world he had sought to transform. What does it mean to hold such a document in your hands? What does it mean to read the private correspondence of a mass murderer, to follow his reasoning, to understand his frustrations and his ambitions, to see, in cold and detailed prose, the machinery behind the horror? It is an unsettling experience, as anyone who has read deeply in the Abbottabad materials will attest. It is unsettling because it humanizes, to a degree, someone we have always found it easier to think of as simply a monster. It is unsettling because it reveals the intelligence and the calculation behind the violence, the careful strategic thinking, the long-term vision. It is unsettling because it shows us a man who was, in some ways, very much like us. Someone who read books, who worried about his reputation, who argued with colleagues, who was frustrated by subordinates who did not follow his instructions, who thought about the future and worried about whether the project of his life would succeed. And it is unsettling because it reminds us that the violence was not the product of madness. It was the product of choice. Deliberate, calculated, ideologically motivated choice. Made by a man who was, by any measure, intelligent and capable of sophisticated thinking, and who had chosen to direct that intelligence and capability toward the destruction of human life on a massive scale. That is, in the end, what the Abbottabad documents tell us about Osama bin Laden. Not that he was a monster, though the effects of his choices were monstrous, but that he was a human being who made choices, and that those choices destroyed thousands of lives and set the world on a path that is still unfolding. The compound in Abbottabad has since been demolished. The Pakistani government tore it down in 2012, citing security concerns and the fact that it had become a pilgrimage site for some and a target for others. The physical space where Osama bin Laden spent the last years of his life no longer exists. But the materials taken from that space, the documents, the files, the records of a private world that no one outside those high walls was ever supposed to see, survive. They are in archives in Virginia and elsewhere, still being studied, still being analyzed, still yielding their secrets. And the story they tell is one of the most important stories of our age. A story about the limits of ideology, about the costs of violence, about the gap between grand ambition and brutal reality, about the enduring power of ideas that refuse to die even when the men who articulate them are gone. A story that is not over. A story that the world is still living. The body of Osama bin Laden was taken from Abbottabad to a U.S. aircraft carrier in the North Arabian Sea, where it was washed according to Islamic burial rites and committed to the sea. The decision to bury him at sea was deliberate. American officials did not want his grave to become a shrine. They wanted no marker, no monument, no focal point for the veneration or the rage that his memory was certain to inspire. They wanted him to disappear as completely as possible from the physical world, leaving only the record of what he had done and what he had believed and what he had ultimately failed to achieve. It was, in its way, a fitting end for a man who had spent years hiding, years without a fixed address, years as a ghost in the global consciousness. He had lived without a visible place in the world, and he would be buried without one. Only the archive remained, the thousands of pages and the hundreds of thousands of files, the private record of a very public catastrophe, locked in government vaults and parceled out, piece by piece, for a world still trying to understand how we got here and where we are going. The raids on bin Laden's compound cost the lives of no American service members. The helicopter that crashed in the compound's courtyard was destroyed by the SEALs before they left, a standard protocol to prevent sensitive technology from falling into Pakistani hands. The SEALs exfiltrated on a backup helicopter that had been standing by, taking bin Laden's body and the collected intelligence materials with them. By the time Pakistani military forces arrived at the compound, the Americans were gone. The announcement of bin Laden's death came in the late evening hours of the 1st of May, Washington time, in a brief, carefully prepared statement from President Obama delivered from the East Room of the White House. The president chose his words with precision, saying that the United States had conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, and a terrorist who was responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children. He spoke of the families who had lost loved ones on September 11 and in the years of conflict that followed. He spoke of the determination of the American people and the American military. And he spoke, with appropriate caution, about the fact that bin Laden's death did not mean the end of al-Qaeda or the end of the threat of terrorism. That caution was well-founded. In the years since the raid on Abbottabad, the world has had ample reason to understand that the killing of bin Laden, however significant as a symbolic and strategic moment, was not the end of the story. Al-Qaeda continues to operate in diminished but still dangerous form in Yemen, in North Africa, in Syria, in Somalia, and elsewhere. The Islamic State, though its physical caliphate was destroyed by a coalition of forces in 2019, continues to inspire attacks around the world. New jihadist organizations have emerged in West Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Europe. The ideology that bin Laden spent his life propagating has proven far more durable than the man who propagated it. And yet, the Abbottabad raid and the intelligence it produced were not without consequences. The materials collected from the compound provided a foundation for operations that disrupted al-Qaeda networks, removed key operatives from the battlefield, and degraded the organization's capacity in ways that are difficult to quantify but real nonetheless. The picture of al-Qaeda's internal structure and communications that emerged from the documents allowed analysts to understand the organization in new ways, to identify vulnerabilities, to anticipate strategies. In the grinding, unglamorous business of long-term counterterrorism, that kind of intelligence is worth an enormous amount. There is also a historical value that goes beyond the immediate operational context. The Abbottabad documents are a record of a moment in the history of global terrorism, a moment when the movement's founder and central figure was still alive and still engaged, when the organization he had built was under unprecedented pressure but had not yet fragmented into the more diffuse and in some ways more difficult to counter form it would later take. They are a record of a world that, in important respects, no longer exists. A world where al-Qaeda's core leadership, however diminished, was still a coherent entity with a recognizable chain of command and a singular ideological vision. That world changed on the night of the 2nd of May, 2011, when a team of Navy SEALs flew low over the darkened hills of northern Pakistan and into history. The raid itself took less than 40 minutes. The intelligence it produced will be studied for decades. And the questions it raises about the nature of extremism, about the limits of military power, about the relationship between ideology and violence, about the long arc of the conflict that began on a clear September morning 20 years ago, will be with us for a very long time. This has been the story of what happened on the night of the raid on Abbottabad, and of what the world found when it opened the archive that Osama bin Laden left behind. A story about secrets and shadows, about the private mind of a public monster, about the gap between the world as it is and the world as a certain kind of man imagines it should be. A story that is not, for all the finality of that night in Abbottabad, finished. A story that the world is still writing, with all the uncertainty and all the cost that implies. The compound is gone. The body is at the bottom of the sea, but the archive remains. And in the archive, in the thousands of pages and the hundreds of thousands of files seized from a high-walled house in a Pakistani garrison town on the night of the 2nd of May, 2011, the story of Osama bin Laden and of everything he set in motion continues to speak. That is the full story of the compound and the archive of Osama bin Laden. If you made it all the way to the end, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss an investigation like this one. Drop a like if this story gave you something to think about, and leave a comment below telling us what part of this story shocked you the most. Was it the scale of what was found in those files? Was it bin Laden's private concerns about al-Qaeda's reputation? Was it the picture of the man himself, hunched in front of a television, watching his own image flicker across the screen in a room he almost never left? Tell us, We read every single comment. This is Cold Case History Report. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next investigation.